Meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission with City Council Ordinance Committee. It's Tuesday, December 8th. It's about 6:45. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it?
None from
Okay.
staff.
All right, then we have our agenda as presented, and I just forgot to just welcome everybody who's here. Yet another one of our COVID remote meetings. Getting a little tired of it, but it's better than not having meetings at all, I suppose. So glad everybody's able to make it. Our second item, item 2, is conflicts of interest. Folks may have seen in the packet, I think it was on pages 47 and 48, we got a communication from some of the members of the public who have been participating a lot in our short-term rental meetings, and they raised a number of issues in there. And one of the issues that they raised and they asked is that the committee, all of us, confirm that all members are free of conflict of interest before proceeding further. And I just wanted to take this on outside of the short-term rental discussion. I thought it would be better to start off with this. It's something that I looks like is of interest to the public and seemed like it would be a good thing to address. And then once we are, we've gone through this, then we could go into the regular part of our agenda. But I did want to just talk about this first. And I'll start off, and then I think Kim may have something to add from the city attorney's perspective. And then, if anyone else wants to chime in. And I'll just give my general perspective on conflicts that we have on the Planning Commission. Unlike some of the other bodies that actually, like the Development Review Board or some of the other ones that are dealing with specific proposals, ours that deal with zoning changes of the Planning Commission, what we do is ultimately make recommendations to the City Council, and City Council is the one that does the final adoption of everything. But zoning is something that always applies throughout the city. And on probably any zoning matter that I've seen, all of us, or just about all of us, always could feel the impact of it one way or another of what that zoning will be. I'll say, like using the Airbnb, the short-term rentals. I've talked about it with my family about at some point, would we ever want to do it? So in one sense, that's an impact. In another sense, there's a chance my neighbors might want to do an Airbnb, and that's another impact. And I think that's the nature for all of us, is whatever we're doing on zoning, it's going to impact us one way or another, either indirectly or directly. I know there's a question about whether Emily had a conflict. And I recall at the very beginning or very early parts of our discussions when we were first bringing up the Airbnb and short-term rentals, Emily told us a few times, and I think it was more, I'm not sure if it was in the context of a disclosure of a potential conflict, or it was just saying, here's a way that all this could impact. She had let us know that she uses Airbnb to help rent out for a month or two at a time, that she does the 30-day or more, I think is what she had said, and she could certainly speak to herself. But that was part of our early discussions. I don't remember if it came up more recently, but I do recall that was part of our early discussion. So, all of us at one point or another have different kinds of conflicts. And I'll say from what I've seen and what I've heard from everybody, I don't see that there's a conflict that rises to a level of a particular interest where, we've seen some where someone may be representing somebody who came to us proposing a specific zoning change for a specific client, if there's a specific customer or something like that. And for those, I think by and large, folks have stepped back and said, I'm going to not deal with this. But when it's something that deals with, could impact your home, could impact how much, what you do in our city, could impact what you do at the waterfront, we've never stepped down for that one. And we will always have conflicts because that's the nature of what zoning is. It will always impact us. And, and I believe, and Kim, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but by and large, where there's a potential conflict, it's up to the individual board members to decide whether it's there and whether to step down. I'm not sure, and again, Kim, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that there's any particular place where the commission acts as a whole to disqualify anybody on a conflict. There may be a place, but I'm not sure of it. So, I mean, that's my take on a conflict with us in dealing with short-term rental or really with any matter. But I'm happy to hear from anybody else who might want to weigh in on this one as well. And Kim, it might be good if you could just give from the city attorney's office their perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Andy. And just generally, I think Andy covered it very well. There are differences in conflicts of interest. There's direct ones, indirect ones. Direct ones, directly financially impact yourself versus indirect with family or friends. But there's also a distinction between the DRB versus the Planning Commission and boards that are reviewing an application directly versus the Planning Commission when it's looking at general legislation that's affecting, a large class of people. And it'd be more concerning, as Andy said, and we agree that if, you were looking at a zoning change that affected one or two parcels and there was a potential conflict there, then it's should be something where you're considering recusing yourselves, certainly. But this is more of a generalized change to the law. It will affect many people in the city. So it's more of the legislative function of your board. Also, as Andy said, I think, we do recommend if there's a perceived conflict to state it ahead. But I understand that was done here. So hopefully that helps. But I think if there's questions, I can answer them for you.
Great, thanks. And any other comments, questions from anybody? Emily?
Thanks. I do want to be clear if there's any ambiguity about this, that I did disclose that I use Airbnb on more than one occasion, very clearly in the meetings, and asked that it be put in the minutes. I used Airbnb not for short-term rentals. I source my own roommates that live in my owner-occupied home with Airbnb. So I take this very seriously. For someone who I serve on 3 different nonprofit boards, spend a lot of my time doing public service, and there's nothing more serious than having someone call in to question your integrity. And I just want to be very clear that I brought it to the attention of everyone because I could foresee that it might become an issue, and I wanted to be clear about the ways that I used Airbnb. I've been careful to not do short-term rentals because they're not a permitted use. And I want to remind everyone that is speaking up about their use of short-term rentals, that it's not a permitted use. So that's why I've opted to use it for long-term rentals. So that's all I have to say about that.
Great, thanks, Emily. Anybody else want to speak, comment, or anything on conflicts? Okay, David, Megan, did you have anything? Okay, good. Then thank you. I just wanted to, again, bring that up right from the get-go because I know it's an issue that is on the mind of at least the folks who sent us the communication, and I wanted to make sure that we addressed it. So thank you. Next item is our public forum, item 3. We will, as we've done before, we're getting to short-term rentals right after this item. And when we get to short-term rentals, David, Megan, Scott are going to give us a presentation following up on our last meeting. The plan is after they're done with their presentation, we're going to go to the public to weigh in and give us their comments rather than having them during public forum. So if people could hold off who might want to be speaking on Airbnb or short-term rentals until we get to item 4, that would be great. And so item 3 on public forum is an opportunity to speak on just about anything else you'd like to speak to, if there's anybody in the public who'd like to address us. Megan, do you know if there is anyone?
So I do have a record of the people who contacted me before the meeting to speak about short-term rentals. So we'll call on them when we get to that point, Andy. If anybody would like to speak on an item that's not on the agenda, you can either use the raise hand feature in Zoom, or you can leave a quick message in the chat just to indicate your name and that you want to speak. If you're calling in on a phone only, you can dial *9 to raise your hand. Andy, I recognize most of the names here. I think many of these people are here to talk to you all about short-term rentals. So unless I see a hand come up in the next few seconds, I think we're all set.
Okay, great, thanks. So then we'll move to item 4, which is the proposed CDO amendment for short-term rentals. We've obviously been going over this one quite a bit over the last year or so. And at our last meeting, we had a number of different questions and issues that came up, and asked staff to go back and take a closer look at them and come back to us with some thoughts or recommendations on and more information about dealing with our questions and comments. So I think Megan, Scott, you have some information for us.
We do. So Scott, I don't know if you want to lead this off or if you want me to dive in.
Boy, talk about putting me on the spot. I'll defer to you, Megan, actually, and then let me pipe in if need be.
Okay, that sounds good. So I just shared my screen with the committee. We don't have a long presentation. So we'll just share here briefly and then as needed during the discussion. But, you know, in reflecting on the conversation at the last meeting, I think, you know, staff really heard a couple of things that Andy summarized pretty well at the end of the discussion. The first were some specific thoughts on how to revise the current draft ordinance that's in your agenda packet, specifically related to 2 issues: the questions about who the host is, whether they're an owner or a tenant, and when they're required to live on the property. And I think that there were a lot of comments by members that reflected on the feeling that the host should be the owner, except for limited circumstances that would allow for a tenant to rent their own unit, and that the host must live on the property in all scenarios. And I'll say with a caveat, which we'll get to in just a second. There was also a lot of discussion and questions about this issue of a fee, which we've shared with the committee before is really outside of the scope of this committee, because any new fees that would be required of short-term rentals would require a charter change to be considered, and would require the council to consider what mechanism and for what reason it wants to levy that fee. So we can walk through in a little more detail, you know, how those changes could be reflected in the ordinance. But I think we also heard that, you know, a couple of loose ends, a couple of things that the committee seemed to still be grappling with. And that in particular being the relationship between the zoning ordinance and this question of fees. And, you know, one member in particular of this committee had suggested toward the end of the conversation that there might still be a path to allowing some scenarios where a short-term rental could operate with a host that doesn't live on the property if a substantial alternative fee is able to be put in place to kind of serve as an almost like an impact fee, but not an impact fee. So in contemplating about how to help you move forward from that discussion, or to kind of consider how you move forward from that discussion, the staff really talked about 2 things. I think if the committee is at the point where it feels like it has worked through a lot of the policy questions that you've had before you, you can direct us as a staff to incorporate the changes that you had discussed in your last meeting into the draft ordinance that's in your packet now. And we can, you know, schedule it for a public hearing at an upcoming meeting of this committee. I think if the committee is interested in exploring the idea of, the interface of zoning with other policy changes, like a fee through a charter change, there is a potential route that we could pursue by considering a zoning policy that's maybe a little bit more flexible and permissive at the outset, pending the outcome of a charter change process, for example. Some kind of a zoning policy that we could adopt on a temporary basis that has a sunset provision in it that would allow you to consider the outcome of a decision about a fee or any other, rental housing, other kind of mechanisms that need to be put in place to work in conjunction with the zoning amendment. So we just wanted to share that we see these as, kind of potentially the two options that this committee could consider in terms of how they move forward to tonight or in, the near term. We have outlined, and I summarized them here, but we have also outlined kind of what the impacts, if you decide to move forward with just incorporating the feedback from your last meeting into the zoning ordinance. If you want to move forward with that, we have a couple slides here that summarize it. So we've talked a lot about the number of short-term rentals that are allowed in buildings of different sizes and when and if the host has to live on the property. And this is a chart that is probably too much to read in one go, but summarizes the current draft ordinance that's in your packet that we had been discussing prior to last week's meeting. This slide, I think, boils down your discussion from the last meeting into a couple of changes. As I mentioned before, the first thing we heard was changing the requirements that the host of a short-term rental be the owner of the property, with some limited exceptions for a tenant to rent their own short-term rental that they own unit that they occupy. That the host would be required to live on the property for all scenarios. And this really impacts the current proposal, most specifically related to multi-unit properties. So this was the one property type that this committee had previously discussed allowing some off-site hosting for. But I think if you want to make that change, it would return this property type to require the host to live on the property. And then again, this just notes at the bottom that, there was kind of this outstanding question about what to do about offsite hosting if you would like to consider allowing it, and what would be the mechanism to do that. We really see that that would be something outside of this process, but could be considered as part of the zoning process if you want to pursue a time-limited zoning amendment at the outset of this process. So I think, Andy, beyond that, there were a couple of other questions that we didn't get into the weeds on at the last meeting that we would like to hear from the committee on. In particular, if you're feeling comfortable with the limit to the number of short-term rentals in different buildings. And a related question of, if you want to consider properties that exceed those limits to be a hotel and regulated as a hotel, or to simply not allow them to exceed those limits. And we can talk about what that means too. So that's really what we've prepared for you in response to your questions at the last meeting. There is one thing that we wanted to come back to just really quickly. We talked at a few meetings ago about a question from the committee about whether we can revoke zoning permits. And we had talked about, that zoning permits, once they're issued, if the zoning changes, they're allowed to continue as a non-conforming use until that use is discontinued. One of the things that we've talked about at a staff level that's a little bit different about short-term rentals from other types of uses is that they can be discontinued more easily than some other types of uses might be. And so we want to make sure that, especially in the case of putting limits on the number of short-term rentals that can be in a building, that there is an opportunity for, if somebody's no longer using that permit, that somebody else could get a permit for a short-term rental in that building. But also to give us a little bit more, what did we say, Scott? Be a little bit more nimble in dealing with discontinuances. So one of the things that we've talked about is actually, adding as a condition to our zoning permits, the requirement that if you're, operating a short-term rental, if you have a zoning permit for a short-term rental, the way that you prove that you're continuing that use is by annually applying for your rental housing permit for the short-term rental. And that's a little bit different than how other types of zoning permits are issued, but it would give us a little bit more flexibility and responsiveness to when these things really go away, that somebody doesn't have a zoning permit that's sitting for many, many years without being utilized. So we talked about this really briefly a couple meetings ago, but we just wanted to bring this up for the committee again, because I think it's important within the context of thinking about, how zoning changes that might be made today, if you make changes to them in the future, how permits that are issued might be impacted by those changes in the future. And I think that is all then.
Just 2 brief points, if I may. So Megan had mentioned rental permitting. I just want to be clear that it's rental registration. We've been talking since day one that short-term rentals would register as a rental, just like long-term rentals. And what she was referring to with the zoning permit was that would basically be contingent on someone continuing to renew their annual rental registrations. That's really all that's going on there. We're not talking about an additional permitting layer going on here. And the other brief point I would make, Megan presented 2 basic choices here tonight. Going with the upshot of the most recent discussion is a little bit more stringent, adopt it and be done. The other avenue is a little bit more lenient, a little bit more flexible, and it would have a sunset provision. There's a couple ways we can get there, but the idea there is we would see how things work out for a while, and we'd have a deadline to fish or cut bait on that after it's been in place for a while.
Yeah, it would give us a date certain to come back to and continue our analysis of how the early implementation of the zoning would be going, and whether or not any refinements or other changes, were or should be made.
And that's particularly pertinent depending on the kind of the disposition of some sort of a charter change and fee going forward, that the extent to which that factors into the decision making of the commission and the council ultimately.
Good. Was there anything else at this stage?
Not from staff. I think we can help answer any other questions that the committee might have when you get to your discussion, but that was all we had prepared for you.
Okay, great, thank you. So I want to go to the public forum on the short-term rentals next, but are there any just clarifying questions that you have for Megan and Scott? Anyone have for Megan or Scott before we go to the public? Soraya?
This isn't really a clarifying question. I wasn't planning on saying this under conflict of interest because I didn't really think it was so, but just hearing the natures of Emily's, I guess I also want to say, I haven't for the last 2 years used Airbnb in Burlington, but before that I rented out both my own apartment. My roommate and I would take turns renting out each other's rooms when we traveled long term. And I've also booked Airbnbs in Burlington maybe 4.5 years ago. So just to make sure that's also on the record.
Great, thanks, Soraya. Okay, then let's go to our to the public forum on the short-term rentals. Megan, do you want to recognize people?
Yeah, I have a short list of people who reached out to me before the meeting, but anyone else who's interested in speaking that hasn't already said so, you can use the raise hand or you can leave a comment in the chat and we will work through the list of speakers. The first speaker that reached out is Ellis McArdle. Jamie Sharp, I allowed you to speak, thinking that might also include Ellis.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Intelligent, informed regulation should be backed by hard data. Where is this data? It simply does not exist. The fact we even have to say this is just the very tip of the heavily maligned STR iceberg we have all been sinking from, due largely in part from a few committee members. Before getting too deep here, we need to address something else vitally important to this process: Zoom. Zoom has proven to be a great asset for the most part during this pandemic in the remote work world. What these STR negotiations have proven is that Zoom has been used as nothing more than an incredibly detrimental liability. It has lent legitimacy to out of sight, out of mind, from at least how us hosts feel relating to our presence and voice. If we can't be seen, how can we expect to be heard effectively? These public comments during Zoom calls are lacking the in-person effect. Body language in the in-person human element had previously made us felt heard at the very least. We have felt unheard during these Zoom meetings because we are seemingly invisible. We need to have at least an equal physical presence to committee members in order to be on the same playing field. We as hosts asked to be on camera for the next meeting. Committee members are allowed discussion after their comments, while public comments lack any discussion or even acknowledgement for that matter. In addition, because we are handicapped on these meetings, the faceless public comment part of these meetings at least needs to be heard from all members who are at the meeting from the start. To join a meeting, be an active proponent of host disenfranchisement, and then leave the meeting without hearing what the public, or rather what mom and pop hosts have to say, is just reprehensible professional negligence. It was beyond frustrating to see this exact behavior from a fellow committee member at the last meeting. Whether intentional or not, perception, for good or worse, is often reality. And the perception of the host coalition is that a few members of this committee simply have sabotaged the entire process for their love of debating baseless hypotheticals. They've single-handedly eliminated all of the progress and productive compromise we had made over the last several months. The silence we are witnessing from committee members who were previously and consistently engaged on this issue when we were making progress is palpable. I am in no way speaking on their behalf, but if I were in their position, I would most definitely feel equally as frustrated by particular members who have backpedaled us to where we were 9 months ago. It's time for fellow members of this committee to do the right thing and speak up. These particular members who have set us back months and who are brand new to the committee, having been absent for the better part of a year, are seemingly the strongest voices in recent meetings, leading with dangerous opinions and incredibly misinformed conclusions based entirely on their gut instinct with zero data. Should we railroad people's ability to be able to afford to live in Burlington based on gut instinct or hard data? Enough said. The city has found its scapegoat for this, quote, housing crisis. The data that actually is available clearly shows this is about affordability, not availability. Limiting STRs would just contribute to more availability, with vacancy already climbing considerably, mind you, in recent years, and not address affordability, as our units would mostly all demand top long-term rental dollars. Just north of 1% of all housing stock being STR, vacancy rates consistently climbing, development soaring in recent years, rent inflation falling. Please, at the very least, see our report in the minutes to help inform your decisions moving forward. But we are trending in the exact opposite direction one would think we would need to be as a catalyst for any form of STR regulation. The limited data that actually is available clearly does not show an existential housing crisis with STRs whatsoever in any way being a contributing negative force to the community. There is also no data that shows any numbers whatsoever of STR's direct impact on any possible housing issues. STRs thus far have been nothing but a win-win for both the city and host alike. Any claims otherwise is pure lazy disinformation and dangerous rhetoric, where the average struggling STR host in 2020 just becomes a scapegoated, convenient fall guy for someone's highly uninformed narrative. The only available current data was simply misguided estimated number of STRs, number of housing units, vacancy rates, rent inflation, and new housing development trends. Don't you think there should at least be data available that directly correlates STR's impact on the community, the city, and available housing stock? To make any decisions without this data is dangerous behavior for city committees moving forward. One line of defense we've heard consistently is that the rationale for these discussions is to prevent a problem from happening in the future, to be proactive now to prevent possible calamity. For that explanation to have any merit, there should very well be proofs of cracks forming on the surface. There are absolutely zero cracks here. Large landlords with dozens or hundreds of units would have largely already entered the STR space 2 or 3 years back. Most do enough volume where the margins they operate under with long-term rentals more than pay their bills. As one large landlord told me, it's just not worth my time. We don't buy whatsoever this "we have to be proactive now" approach to prevent issues in the future. We need guided or increasingly bad problems in order to enact good, fair, and well-informed regulations for the future. To be honest, it makes us lose faith and confidence entirely of these city bodies doing what's right for the community instead of what's right for their own agendas, possible political aspirations, and egos. Again, we are not commercial operations here. Find me anyone on this call who owns 50, 25, even 3 properties in Burlington. My guess is that you will not find many. As the host coalition has outlined many times before, there is a reason why mom and pop landlords make up the vast majority of the representation at these meetings, because we are the ones who will be impacted the most by a large margin, not landlords who own tons of property, not tenants who are being squeezed because of us evil STR hosts. It is mom and pop property owners just trying to afford to live here because we are the ones who stand to lose the most while everyone else really gains nothing. Effective solutions need real problems. We simply do not have a real problem. As a proud leftist, even I can say these current proposals are progressive extremism at its finest, without any hard data to back them. We are setting a dangerous precedent moving forward with potentially devastating solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Julie Marks.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
And can Andy see my screen?
We can see your name on the screen, but in the webinar format, we cannot see videos.
Okay, that's unfortunate. Well, good evening. I'd like to start by thanking Ellis and sharing my support of his testimony. I'm speaking tonight because, like many short-term rental hosts, I'm pretty frustrated with how the past couple of meetings have gone and how the policy recommendations have reverted back to almost where we started almost a year ago. I've been very disappointed to watch some committee members attend these meetings unprepared, and to be quite honest, it's extremely offensive when a committee member here can't remember a previous discussion or a testimony, because the consequence of their confusion and flip-flopping could determine whether or not I have a job next year. The recommendations as they stand now will put me out of business, a business that I worked hard to create, and a job that brings me joy, benefits my family, benefits my tenants, and benefits the city of Burlington. Tonight, I'd like to remind you of my situation and ask once again to please not exclude me from participating in Burlington's home sharing marketplace. For those of you who don't remember me or haven't met me yet, my name is Julia, although most people call me Julie. I'm 34, born and raised in Vermont, and I am an aspiring entrepreneur who loves to garden and cook. I'm here today and have been showing up all year because this issue affects a property that is deeply personal to me. I own a property in Burlington that has been in my family for over 30 years. This house is on Elmwood Avenue in a mixed-use zone, and is the place that I took the bus to every day after school and did my homework as a kid while my dad finished his work in the front office. It's the house my brother and I renovated with our own 2 hands for my mother after my parents divorced and she needed a new home. It contains the bedroom that I spent countless hours in struggling through the deepest depression of my life. And when I moved back to Vermont after grad school, hoping to find a way to make a living in this jobless state, this house was my home. Now I live in Jericho, a whole 20-minute drive away from the Elmwood house. The house that was once my dad's office, then my mother's home for 10 years, is now registered as having 3 apartments, which I own and manage proudly. 2 of the units house long-term tenants. The third unit is a studio that I offer as a short-term rental for half the year and a long-term rental for the other half the year. Although the data presented to you misrepresents my listing on Airbnb as a long-term short-term rental, when in fact it should be weighted as a 0.5 or 0.25 contributor. Similarly to Emily's listing on Airbnb, if she's counted then as a one of the STRs in your data, she shouldn't be, because it's not short-term. I want to emphasize this point because I'm not alone. Many STRs do not operate an STR year-round for reasons that vary by owner. For me, I've chosen to rent my third apartment in this hybrid approach for several reasons. Number one is that short-term rentals earn more money faster, which allows me to make the necessary annual home improvements I need to keep my 200-year-old historic house up to code and current efficiency standards. And you can check my tax returns. I profited $3,000 from this year with my Burlington STR because most of the money I put back into the property immediately. The new slate roof that my property needs was quoted to me this summer at $100,000. How can I continue to afford upkeep without bringing in revenue? And I want to do a quick sidebar because I don't have to do this. I could pocket all my earnings and just pay the expenses and let the house degrade. But I'm not a slumlord and I have no interest in being one. I take great pride in contributing positively to the aesthetic of Burlington's built environment and the availability of high quality housing in Burlington. Number two, my family and I use this studio apartment for personal reasons several times throughout the year for various lengths of time. Being able to regain access into this personal space of mine is essential to caring for certain family members while also enriching my own life and being able to spend quality time in a place in a city that means so much to me personally. And my third reason for operating my business this way is that, like all college towns, Burlington is a transient city. A good portion of renters are students, temporary workers, or young families who quickly outgrow of downtown spaces. Burlington is also a tourist hub with an economy that heavily relies on tourism. And we've seen this most direly through the pandemic. My location is perfect for tourists or mature students who want to get away from the hill. My house is 1 block from Church Street. It's in a mixed use zone and has been used for commercial purposes in the past. Because Burlington sees such seasonal trends in who's living where and why, I have consistently offered long-term renting in my studio during the winter months when school is in session and tourism has subsided. So do you really believe that the way in which I have chosen to manage my property, create a business, and find personal fulfillment is harming the housing supply in Burlington? I argue no, it is not causing harm. In fact, short-term rentals have many benefits. The home sharing marketplace opens Burlington up to newcomers while allowing old-timers to afford to stay. STRs bring dollars to Burlington's businesses and tax revenue to Burlington's municipality. STR allows landlords to keep long-term tenant rents low while still being able to afford upkeep of our buildings. As a local landlord and local STR host, Burlington is my business. Even though I don't live in Burlington, I am a steward of this town, not the cause of a 50-year housing shortage. As a landlord and STR host, ensuring that my tenants are happy, my property is well cared for, and that my short-term guests spend every single penny of theirs downtown is my business. And I can't help but mention that even my tenants have supported me and helped me on occasion, and they like doing it. My scenario benefits Burlington. The people who use my STR have benefited Burlington. But because you don't have comprehensive data on the benefits of Burlington's short-term rentals, I want to quickly introduce you to a few of the people who have relied on my short-term rental in Burlington this past year. Becca is a Burlington resident who needed a 5-day housing stay for her and her little cat when she was in between a lease. Jane and Nick were a couple who stayed for 10 days while they house hunted in Burlington looking for their new home. Brittany was a UVM student who was kicked out of her dorm for 6 weeks due to COVID back in March. Veronica was a visiting professor at UVM who's enriching on-campus offerings. Henry was an actor who was in a show at the Flint Theater that ran for several weeks. A woman whose name I won't mention found me because she needed to escape from her boyfriend while she was living in Burlington. And Nicolina was a traveling nurse who left her husband at home, came to Burlington for 2 months during the COVID crisis. And that doesn't include the countless middle-class travelers who are now able to come to Burlington and afford to stay. In a previous time before STRs, they wouldn't have been able to come and stay in downtown Burlington. Again, I insist that the data being presented to you is incomplete and misleading in its current form. And so I repeat my original plea from January. Delay this action until a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis can be performed and vetted. There is no reason that this issue poses such urgency as to warrant exemption from the best practice of evidence-based policymaking. With no evidence supporting that short-term rentals as they exist today are adversely affecting Burlington's housing markets, there are only 2 scenarios you should be focused on preventing. 1, the conversion of entire multi-unit buildings into STRs. And 2, the operation of STRs in properties that receive public funding incentives, which may already be a violation of written law somewhere and only needs better enforcement. But until you have sound data on the impact of the remaining scenarios like mine, I encourage you to just start with those 2 and create a system for us that allows landlords and property owners to register for short-term rental permits, schedule regular inspections so that you actually can start collecting the meaningful information you need. And meanwhile, allow local off-site property owners to operate STRs in Burlington, as I do. If you don't approach this carefully, I guarantee this will only aggravate the very group of housing providers you should be incentivizing. I don't think you want to aggravate the very people with the means, energy, and interest in investing in Burlington's housing market. And the last point I want to make is that yesterday, Airbnb announced the establishment of Airbnb.org, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that enables hosts like me to offer their place to persons in need of temporary housing at no cost. This type of program provides a way for people escaping natural disasters, people arriving to Vermont as refugees, and emergency responders to find free, high-quality temporary housing, which in theory would prevent these types of transient, in-need persons from consuming Burlington's long-term housing offerings or limiting shelters. I bring this up because it exemplifies the innovative and dynamic nature of our world today and the unpredictable ways in which things, even the way we address housing issues, can change rapidly. If Burlington truly prides itself on being called a progressive city, then it should live up to that meaning. The very definition of progressive calls for the allowance, if not the promotion, of new ideas and new ways of doing things. Let's not create policy that hinders Burlington's housing market from evolving and innovating. And let's not create policy that limits opportunities for Vermonters to participate in a local home sharing marketplace. So I challenge the committee not to merely impose restrictions, but to come up with ways to provide opportunity. As a landlord, I need more options, more flexibility, more support from the city, not less. If I am not permitted to operate my property and my business as the market dictates and in the way that best suits the evolving needs of my family, of my tenants, and my property, you can trust that my 3 apartments will not be contributing to an affordable housing market. I will be forced to raise my rents. Do not restrict STRs so tightly. Everything that exists here right now is not causing a problem. None of us are the scenario you should be fighting to prevent. Keep us, and we will continue to do good things for this city, for our tenants, and for our neighbors. The solution to creating and incentivizing more housing, especially affordable housing in Burlington, certainly lies elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next person is Deb Lyons.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you again. I'd also like to thank Ellis McArdle and Jamie Sharp for the comprehensive information that they shared in the documents found in your agenda packet. I hope you will read through their submission very carefully because it covers many aspects of the housing market as it relates to short-term rentals. Why is this agenda packet that Ellis created imperative to the Planning Committee? I believe there is a gap, as others have said, in the data you have collected so far. A gap that needs to be filled before this committee can make fully informed recommendations on the limits and restrictions of short-term rentals. My concern lies with the current proposal that does not allow for a non-owner occupied building to be rented as a short-term rental. I believe this scenario should be allowed with reasonable limits and that it's not in conflict with your efforts to support long-term rentals for tenants. Herein lies the problem. Without quality, real-time data, you are missing the opportunity for a complete, accurate, and reliable picture of STR rentals within Burlington's housing market. In fact, on page 9 of the June 2019 Housing Summit document that was also part of the packet today, 2 bullets included: 1, the need for a study examining the state of short-term rentals in the city and to ensure the structure is in place to inspect and enforce before diving into regulations. 2, the question was asked, who are the typical owners of STRs? That's in the packet from June 2019. For sure, you've met some of us already, and clearly we can all agree on the importance of collecting current and relevant research in relation to these issues. As an example of data changing, in November, just last month, Portland, Maine voted to allow unhosted or non-owner occupied short-term rentals. They have capped unhosted STRs at 400, and non-owner occupied rentals account for about half of their total STRs. This is an approach that can work in Burlington, Vermont too. May I suggest this committee vote to register all the STRs in Burlington in April 2021 at the same time as the annual landlord registration to learn who is renting STRs and in what capacity: a room in one's own house, a duplex, triplex, standalone, or multi-unit building. Is the building owner occupied or not, with no penalty for not, with air quotes on that, during this information gathering time? Is a tenant renting their housing on their own or in proxy for the owner? How many STRs does a landlord rent? You can even request information on the number of actual nights rented in 2020, seeing as we are about to come to a close on this horrific year. This and other data that you could collect will allow you to more fully understand the homeowners and community members that utilize STR platforms as an avenue to meet their growing bills and taxes. It makes sense to me to collect this real-time data before you decide how to regulate short-term rentals. This is my simple and basic request. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay. The next person is Lori Katorman. I know you mentioned that you might not be able to make it, so if you are here under a different name, please raise your hand and I'll come back to you. Chris Hasley is the next one. Chris, you should be able to speak if you,
Can you all hear me?
yes.
Okay. Thanks for your time. I will try to be brief and not repeat the things that have already been said. I think there were some good points made about the data. Certainly, we've got a fair amount of that in the original proposal regarding the vacancy rates and the distribution, the types of housing. I've always been a firm believer that public policy needs to be based upon facts and data. And with respect to this particular issue, while I think we have a lot of good data, I don't know that we have complete data. From my perspective, I think we also need to take into consideration the economic impact that is brought upon by Airbnb in terms of the multiplier effect, and would urge that we maybe take a look at that issue before moving forward with a concrete policy proposal. The second point I would like to make is it's been a number of months since I've been actively participating in this, and having reviewed the previous meeting and the packets and everything associated with it, it seems like things have evolved a bit and things have gotten needlessly complex. We're contemplating all sorts of different scenarios here on how to address the issue. And I think at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is preserve, protect, and defend affordable housing, here in the town, in the city. And so let's not get bogged down in the details. And, if you take into consideration the Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, I would argue that perhaps maybe looking at the types of unit is not the yardstick we want to look at. And I'd say maybe we want to look at something more granular, like the number of bedrooms that are coming off. And maybe we look at it from it that way. Maybe say you get so many bedrooms, 1 4-bedroom apartment, or 1 4-bedroom house, or 2 duplexes with 2 2-bedrooms, or something like that. But I just think that we're maybe making this overly complex and overthinking it, trying to account for any possible scenarios. And I can say, having reviewed that data, I'm aware of a couple of other business models that aren't even contemplated in the most recent proposal. So I think simpler is better on that regard. I think finally, that's pretty much what I have to say on that. I appreciate the time to speak to the committee, and hopefully we can continue this discussion down the line. Thank you.
The next speaker is Sharon Busher. Sharon, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for allowing me to speak. As a member of this committee several months ago, I had started out believing firmly that properties should be owner occupied if there was short-term rental. But I did hear the testimony from many people in the public who, like the woman, Julie, that spoke about her particular scenario, convinced me that that maybe that wasn't a requirement. I felt pretty strongly about it for single family and duplexes because of the way we started off after the housing summit, looking at accessory dwelling units and recognizing that these units may indeed become short-term rental and then go back to accessory dwelling units. And I felt that because the criteria were such that accessory dwelling units needed to be owner occupied, I felt that that necessitated consistency within single family and duplexes. And I still feel that way. But with other buildings, I'm not convinced that, I'm not sure why we feel these properties need to be owner occupied. I'm not convinced what the rationale is. I understand the criteria, but I'm not convinced why. And I haven't really heard that articulated very well recently. So that's one thing I wanted to state. I also wanted to just talk about the number of short-term rentals. Someone referenced, I didn't, I'm on the phone and I didn't hear all of it. It might have been Maine or someplace that implemented a limit on the number of short-term rentals, 400. And I think that that's part of the issue, is the fear or concern that we have that we are going to lose too many units that could go to long-term rentals when we do have a housing shortage. And I know that could be debated by some of the not the panelists so much, not the committee members, but maybe the people listening and attending. But I still believe we do have some issues regarding available housing, and that is available affordable housing, give it, so be that. But having said that, I started looking at how we had initially set up to 50% and then it was under 50%. And I did send a comment to staff, which I didn't share with the committee because it was just for the staff to chew on. It wasn't, there was no aha moment. It wasn't like I had some clairvoyant great idea, but I did wonder if we had gone too far with the number of short-term rentals in multi-unit buildings. And I feel that potentially, and I'm even changing what I wrote to them, that maybe we should limit the number that could be created within a multi-unit building and limit that to 2. Under 50%, but no more than 2. And why would I say that? Because I think we don't know what the right number is. I do agree that the data is incomplete. I did bore all of you with the fact that I was a census enumerator. And unlike some of the very good stewards that speak tonight, there are people out there in Burlington, because I went door to door trying to do, head counts and getting information. I know full well that there are a lot of short-term rentals, and I don't know if they would come forward and register as short-term rentals. I really don't know. So I feel that we don't know. I think that having rental registration and short-term registration during the annual rental registration process is a good step. That was one that was contemplated and certainly should be. I agree with what Megan and Scott said, that this would be a way, if people were honest and fully disclosed, this would be a way to understand when a short-term rental was no longer in use. And so I really do support that. So I wanted to make that statement. Then the last statement is that I am, having been part of political processes, I am very concerned about something that would move an agenda item forward more liberally and say, we'll allow this and then we'll come back and review it in 18 months or whatever, because that would be the intent. But if there was some other more urgent or pressing matter, that could be shoved aside and maybe it wouldn't get reviewed in a timely fashion. And the players around the table might be different. And ultimately, it may never get reviewed until somebody went, why does this exist and why have we never updated this? I'm very fearful of any kind of proposal that requires a review, knowing full well that we don't always meet those timelines. So I just want to caution the committee about when you contemplate that, think long and hard about that. So thank you very much for your time. And I do believe that a lot of what you went through at the last meeting was rehashing some of the very items where we began. And I think for those of us listening, it was somewhat frustrating, but for all of you, it's an important part of the process of going back and stepping forward and making sure you get it right. So I understand the need to go back and rehash, and hopefully it will get you to a better place. Thank you.
Can I make a comment, Andy?
Sure.
I don't know if you guys are following the comments that are happening while we're doing this, and I just wanted to call out that I feel like some of the comments are targeting Zariah, and I have to speak up and say that it's just not, if that's where this is going to go, I'm not going to participate. So if the comments get any nastier than they already are, I suggest that we shut down the comments. So I just want to speak up and say that I see the comments, I find them disruptive. And I'd ask that if they continue in that vein, that we shut down the comments.
Okay. Thank you. I hadn't noticed them. Okay. Megan, do we have anybody else?
Yes, we have a couple more, Andy. The next speaker is Michael Monti.
Good evening, committee and counselors. And first, I want to just say thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, good, thanks. I want to say thank you for your service. I know how difficult it is. Counselors, God bless you for all the work that you had to do and the meetings you have to go to on a regular basis. And commissioners, I know this is not an easy decision, and I appreciate the work that you do. And I would, having been on that side of the table, I would never call out anyone for ill intentions, maybe ill-informed on occasion, but never ill intentions. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. So thanks. I think it's a difficult decision that you got in front of you, and I'm broadly sympathetic to some of the comments that were made in terms of folks looking at their existing sort of businesses that they have up and running. But let me just say that, and perhaps there are some other solutions that you haven't thought about and seen, perhaps limiting the number of Airbnbs that are allowed overall in Burlington, allowing some level of grandfathering. I think you probably have had these discussions, but certainly when I hear some people talking, it seems like that may be an approach. But I want to say that there is a crying need for affordable housing, and there is a crying need for additional regular old plain rental units. There is a lack of supply. And I would say that some folks are saying there's hundreds of units coming on. In fact, there have been hundreds of units that have come on over the last 3 to 4 years. And this year we see a precipitous drop in the number of new rental units coming on in Chittenden County. If the number was more like 650 or 700, it's going down to 250, 300. And it's going to be really trailing off. In the meantime, state economists and VHFA specifically believes that the number of new households that are going to be created in Chittenden County over the next 5 years is going to be more like 400 or 500 a year. So clearly the market is not going to keep up the demand of what we really need. And the impact it's going to have in terms of pricing is going to be dramatic. Vacancy rates have changed just a little bit. All of that means that supply is really important for the regular market. As an affordable housing provider, I would say that we need supply, but that is not the solution for affordable housing. So for the Airbnb folks here are saying that we're pinning affordable housing issues on them specifically. I would say that it has some impact, but I couldn't tell you that it has like the most dramatic impact. In order to create affordable housing, in order to have affordable housing, you need to create affordable housing. But the overall market still needs just plain old rental market housing, and it needs it in a really big way. And the Airbnb, frankly, as sort of an industry, takes that out of the market and makes it unavailable to folks. And that, I think, is something to pay attention to. Years ago, and over decades, housing policy has tried to do its best to prevent commercialization, the commercial use of home ownership or of rental properties. In other words, you have all kinds of laws on the books to prevent conversion. Condominium conversion in part so renters are protected, and commercial conversion as well, in terms of from housing into commercial use. That's what you're doing here. That's what you're trying to do. That's essentially what this is about, principally, is basically commercializing rental use. I'll tell you a quick little story, because I'm old and I tell stories like that. Years ago, the King Street neighborhood organized, this is in the 70s, organized itself to ensure that the affordable housing that the housing that existed in the King Street neighborhood would not become gentrified, and in fact will remain affordable forever. They organized the King Street Neighborhood Revitalization Corporation, and that effort created 200 units of low-income housing, low-income affordable housing for people, and that's why that neighborhood now remains an affordable neighborhood for Burlington. Over the last few years, I watched an Airbnb pop up right off on one of those streets. And I could tell you that if that effort to sort of make sure that there was a preservation of rental housing in that neighborhood did not exist, the King Street neighborhood would become just one large bedroom to downtown. It would become really a Airbnb haven. It would be great for the visitors. It'd be great for the property owners, and those folks would have been gone a long time ago. So I would urge you to pay attention to the conversion, essentially, of anything that exists now as a rental property to some other use. The data is there to show that affordable housing is needed. There are 500 people right now in Chittenden County in motel rooms because they have no place else to go. So you may need to get more data, at least that's what these folks are telling you to do, but don't hesitate to know and understand that in fact the need for affordable housing is really, really essential and really important. Thanks.
Okay, the next one is Paul O'Brien. Paul, you should be able to speak. Okay, I know Paul had a little bit of a challenge last time, so we'll come back to Paul. The next one is Lucas Jensen.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I just wanted to make a couple comments. I do want to say thank you to the other hosts that have spoken here, and I really hope you guys are listening closely to what everyone is saying here. So I've been involved in this process pretty much from the beginning, and I feel like the thing that has been lost in this transition to some of the new members in the committee, as well as the length of time that we were sort of shut down from the COVID stuff here, is this failure to understand the current market of short-term rentals in Burlington, and recognizing that the people that are currently participating in short-term rentals are not these large-scale landlords or corporate-style decentralized hotels. We are all individual property owners or small-time mom and pop landlords in Burlington who are struggling to make ends meet. Burlington is a challenging and difficult town to own property in, and short-term rentals has provided all of us that are currently participating, from what I've seen, with a little lifeline that has provided us with some extra income that has allowed us to upkeep our buildings. It's allowed us to not raise rents in other properties that we might own. It's allowed us to contribute to the tourist economy within this city that is so critical. And I just, so we're hearing these stories come out now, and at the beginning of this process, when we had these public meetings, a lot of us spoke there, and I think a lot of that has been forgotten, and I don't really see any recognition of this here. And I'll go a step further on that in saying that we have absolutely no idea how many of us will actually be put out of business if the proposals are put forward as they currently are. That data simply doesn't exist. We also don't know what the loss of meals and rooms tax is going to be to the city, or the loss of tourist revenue in the city. We just simply don't have that data. The second point that I want to make is I feel quite strongly that the recommendations that this committee is looking to make clearly aren't going to reduce the rent for tenants in Burlington. It's not going to increase the availability of apartments. It's not going to reduce housing prices in Burlington. It's not going to fix anything related to this supposed housing crisis. But it is going to have an immediate effect on the short-term rental hosts who are shut down, and it's going to hurt. I currently wouldn't be allowed to continue to operate the one short-term rental that I have, and without that income, it's going to put a real challenge in front of us, my wife and I, and how we make ends meet. And I don't want that to be lost within this committee as you guys consider making these recommendations, that we are real people and the decisions that you're making are messing with our livelihoods, and it's going to hurt us. It's not going to help the housing crisis. That's all I needed to say. Thank you.
Okay, Paul O'Brien is back. Paul, you should be able to speak. Paul, you can unmute yourself. Okay, we'll keep trying. The next person is, so I see Jamie Sharp's hand is up again. I don't know if Jamie wants to speak or if this is Ellis again.
Yeah, this is Ellis.
Okay, Andy, we have a few more speakers who haven't spoken yet. So Ellis, if you would be willing to wait, we can ask Andy if he'll take second comments at the end.
Yeah,
Okay.
I want to make sure we could get through all the ones that haven't spoken, and I do want to make sure we could get to committee discussion tonight.
Okay. So then the next person is Amy Magyar.
Hi, I just wanted to reflect for a second. I know that every one of you can hear the frustration in the speakers tonight, and it's incredible that here we are over a year later with this anger, because I do think that we were headed in such an incredible direction, trying to find win-wins and trying to find ways that, if it was true that we were taking away from the long-term market and housing here, that would be able to be a part of that solution. But I keep coming back to this idea that we're making decisions, or that decisions are being considered based on data that just doesn't exist. And I think back to, in winter, us making that suggestion of getting us all registered. And I think, to Sharon's point about, I don't know if everybody's going to be honest about it, one of the things that happened during COVID was Airbnb proved that they can easily shut any one of us down. And so I want to come back to this idea that even the Housing Summit document had a request for data and research, and just sort of say to the committee again, wouldn't it be incredible to know how many different units there really are? What is their makeup? Having that collected probably within 30 days to be able to make a strong decision. And I will tell you this, is that Airbnb has no problem, and has shown precedent to do this, that if someone is not registered with the city, Megan, Scott, and David can easily give them that information, and Airbnb will shut them down so that they cannot. I can't say what FlipKey and some of these other short-term rental softwares will do, but Airbnb is the big one, and they will shut them down. I think there's an opportunity for us to collect some data. I can't imagine any of you actually buying a car without there being a Carfax, without there being, maybe you never seeing the car, not knowing if it ever runs, but just being told that others like it run really well, and have some faith that this is what we think is happening. I'm not saying that we're right and you're wrong in any way, shape, or form. I think the challenge is we just don't know. And I just want to say it one more time. If there's a way for us to collect some data, I think the hosts, as you can hear, are passionate enough to say, we will help you collect that data. We will show up and register. We'll pay a one-time fee. Whatever you need us to do, let's get the data so that when we make the decision, everybody knows that it was a decision based on facts. That's all I ask for. Thank you.
Paul, I'm going to try you one more time.
How's that?
That works.
Awesome. Thanks so much for giving me another opportunity. I really want to reiterate what I've been saying in the last couple meetings. And it really gets down to, this is a personal thing for the people that are on this call. I know from meeting with them and talking with them, these people rely on this income. And I don't, for the life of me, I'm not sure why or what the motivation is when there's really no data to show that STRs are anyway implicated in the affordable housing crisis that's been promulgated as the reasoning behind limiting short-term rentals. The percentages just north of 1% that of the units in the city. If that's a problem, there needs to be another solution to look at. To hide behind the banner of affordable housing and say we're making progress on that problem by limiting short-term rentals or somehow making a proposal that's targeting them, you're really targeting people. It's disingenuous to say that there's any solution being reached for affordable housing by limiting these short-term rentals. What you're fundamentally doing is taking away people's income. These people are going to be looking at unemployment lines, and that's the reality. And to say that it has any reasoning behind it as affordable housing, that's truly a falsehood. To tell that to the public and say that you're making strides in that by limiting short-term rentals and somehow making a progress on affordable housing, it really is a falsehood. I think you really need to realize that if you're truly trying to limit short-term rentals, give a reason. Tell us what the problem is. If it's a little over 1% of people that have them going, then let's talk about that. I mean, it's disingenuous to limit it based on affordable housing. That's the responsibility of the city. It's been a problem. It's a recognized problem. But to say that this is a solution, it's a falsehood. I've been asking for an answer to a question I've been repeatedly asking on here is why a unit needs to be owner occupied. If it's truly an issue and the number of short-term rentals in the city, this is not the approach to take. It seems to me that the approach would be to look at commercial operations and multi-unit buildings. A short-term rental to have an owner occupied, that's not the proposal that we should be looking at. We should be looking at data and making an informed, rational decision on how to limit short-term rentals and take it out of the context of affordable housing. I'd like the approach to really be connected to some type of a data analysis. And I think we're really lacking in any data that's really showing the benefits of short-term rentals to the city, to not just the finances, the impacts of the taxes and the rooms and meal tax, but I think there's also really good benefits for those tourists to come in here and have an option that's not a hotel, that has the ability to rent out something with your family and to be there with your dog or say with an extended family. There's a necessary reason that people go to short-term rentals in the city. We're a tourist city. They're popular because they provide something that hotels can't. And I really think that we need to have that data to show what's the city going to lose if we go down this route. I don't think, to say it's a true fear of losing housing stock, well then really let's realize how much housing stock we're losing and also look at how much housing stock's coming in. I think Megan put forward some data to show that the vacancy rate actually has increased by 50%. So to say that short-term rentals are a scourge on the housing stock or somehow implicating affordable housing is really not the way to do it. There's no correlation between this housing crisis and short-term rentals. How on earth is just under 2% a problem? It seems to me that we're looking to show the public that we're taking action on affordable housing, and when we're not doing it here. That's a bigger problem that needs to be tackled, but it can't be tackled here. I've seen no data that shows that short-term rentals have had an impact on this housing crisis. Where is it? Why hasn't that been providing? I keep hearing assumptions. I keep hearing falsehoods that short-term rentals are the problem. That's disingenuous. To make any progress on that problem, it's not going to be on the backs of these taxpayers and people that own these houses.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think I keep reiterating the affordable housing because that's what keeps getting thrown back. And it's not the problem that needs to be solved with this solution. I want to know what the motivation is here. And I really want to understand that people know on this committee that these are true people, real families that rely on this income. And without that, they're facing, financial ruin, financial crisis, unemployment lines. That's the reality. I think you really need to understand that these are people. This is not a commercial operation. These are not mega landlords. This is not some big, huge business that's overtaking the city. These are mom and pop places, mom and pop landlords.
Okay.
I just really want to understand and hope and plead with the committee to really look at what the financial benefits are for short-term rentals before you make this decision and what we're really going to lose. Personally, what we're going to lose here, I know from the host, but I want to know what the city's going to lose. I think that should be one of the basis of the decisions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your comments. Megan, how many more do we have for tonight?
I see 2 more people that haven't already spoken, Andy.
Okay, thanks.
The next person is Rolf Danielson.
Excuse me. All right, so my name is Rolf Danielson. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. This evening, I would like to bring to light how the addition of STRs can benefit the community as a whole. Tourism is one of the largest industries in Vermont, in a state that doesn't offer a lot of job opportunities. Before Airbnb and other online hosting platforms were available, much of the lodging industry was dominated by large hotel and motel chains. The advent of these online platforms revolutionized the industry. What was once a difficult industry to compete in now became possible. Individuals connected with individuals to completely change how we travel. For the first time in decades, the industry was no longer ruled by the Hilton, Marriott, or Hyatt brands. The playing field was leveled all of a sudden. Instead of most of the money going to outside investors of large hotel chains, many individuals on a local level could now realize an income off of the lodging industry. While certainly not the goal of this committee, any regulation of the STRs will inadvertently benefit large hotel corporations. I feel that it is important to understand the benefit of having a healthy supply of STRs in the Burlington community, whether or not a host lives on the property or not. Requiring a property to be owner occupied excludes individuals with different needs from realizing an income off of the lodging industry through an STR. Age, disability, or family makeup could factor into whether or not an individual can operate an STR if a housing unit is or becomes no longer suitable as a living situation. There's also no need for a property to be owner occupied over concerns of negative income impact on the neighborhood. As has been mentioned before, overall STR guests are conscientious and buildings with an STR are well maintained. Burlington is in need of affordable housing. And in my opinion, the best way to realize more affordable housing is through the Burlington Housing Trust Fund. Having benefited from Champlain Housing Trust myself, I fully support this program. Instead of the money going to outside large investors, allow Burlington residents the opportunity to realize an income off of STRs and charge a housing replacement fee that goes directly towards funding affordable housing through the Housing Trust. This way, both local hosts and individuals in need of affordable housing benefit. We live in this community and we spend our money in this community. What we are asking for is to host so that we can earn this in this community by sharing the income generated from the Burlington's large lodging industry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And the last person is Erhard Manka.
Evening, folks. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So Erhard Manka, live at 60 Grove Street. And, I think you've heard obviously a lot of compelling arguments from folks who are going to get economically hurt by what appear to be some changes in the thinking of the committee. And I do understand. I was schooled by my former fellow counselor, Sharon Busher, that this has been a long process and that some of us who work in the affordable housing field, like Michael and myself, really weren't aware of where this was all headed and are maybe a little late to the party. And I do apologize for that. I hear the frustration of folks who say that they will be economically harmed. And there's, I think, a lot of sympathy for that. Burlington is an expensive place, and it's hard for people to it's hard for people to eke out a living here and to make it affordable to them. I also hear the arguments around upkeep and how that all helps. I would say, as with my comments at your last meeting, primarily my concern as a longtime affordable housing advocate, and I agree, these units would not necessarily provide affordable housing in the sense of housing that's affordable to very low income people. That's something that Champlain Housing Trust does and other nonprofits that have subsidies available to them. But there is, and our mayor makes this point, I think sometimes very, very convincingly, we have a constrained housing market at all levels of the market. And the rental market, or just a little bit of kind of rental housing 101, when you have a market that is in balance, meaning that supply and demand are in balance, you have roughly a 5% vacancy rate. And I don't know to what extent folks are familiar with, the rental housing market and how it works. But that's when the market is generally considered to be in equilibrium and a good market. When you are for many, many years below 1%, you're in a highly constrained market where rents just keep going up and up, where there's not enough housing for people. People have no housing choice, very little housing choice. And that's a problem for everyone, whether it's people who need affordable housing or people who are middle income that need to rent housing to live here. If there were, for instance, if there are 450 short-term rentals on the market now, they didn't exist before Airbnb came along. They didn't exist whenever that industry started, 10 years ago or so. They, in all likelihood, were rentals before. And if those 400 had remained on the rental housing market, then add that to the current 1.7% vacancy rate, and we would have a rental housing market that is more or less in balance. Now, I'm not suggesting that the good folks that have testified before and that are going to get economically harmed by this, that you're in a difficult position because you're making decisions that potentially harm them economically. And like I said, I think there's a lot of sympathy for that. Michael expressed that as well. So provide a way for those folks who are currently in the business to grandfather, to have an existing use that may become non-complying at some point in the future when you enact an ordinance, or when the city council enacts an ordinance, have them be grandfathered, and don't hurt the folks from whom you've heard compelling testimony. But I personally, and it's not just an unbased fear as some have characterized it, but as the short-term rental housing market grows in Burlington, it does and will take away from the rental market, or from the available housing stock that could be long-term rentals. And that's a problem, because we have traditionally such a low vacancy rate that when we lose a few units here and there, it adds to the problem. So, provide a cutoff rate, whatever the number is, grandfather folks who are existing, take them out of the equation. But let's, going forward, make sure that large investors don't actually come into the market and start renting multifamily units that are over 5 buildings that are over 5 units. I think that's a real problem. And to the question about regulation, I think Michael mentioned condo conversion as well as commercial conversions. We had a very hot real estate market in the 80s when I was on the city council, and that was one of the things that we did. It is legitimate to regulate something that is a public good, and rental housing and having an adequate supply of rental housing is part of the needs of the community, and it addresses the needs of the community just like the economic needs that so many of the short-term rental owners have testified to, that their short-term rentals benefit that market. So there are a number of public goods that you, as decision makers and policy makers for the community, need to balance, and that's clearly one of them. So I would say, find a way to grandfather folks, but going forward, let's really limit this market so that we don't have additional adverse impact on the city's ability to provide rental housing at whatever level of affordability to folks that need rentals. And let me just remind you, we've got 60% of our housing market is rentals. We have a preponderance of renters in this city, and they're struggling, whether they're at a low income level or a moderate income level. I also saw a number of comments in the chat about UVM and the need for student housing. That's been a 30-year problem. When I was on the council, we negotiated back when Peter Clavell was mayor the first agreement with UVM, and for the first time required UVM to house sophomores on campus. It used to be way worse. Just freshmen were needed to be housed on campus. We have made headway over the years in terms of requiring UVM to provide more housing for its students. It's a constant struggle. And yes, that is a large impact on our market, clearly. But again, given the constrained nature of our market, moving more from the rental market, that is the problem. It's not necessarily what we've already lost, but going forward, what we could lose.
Thank you.
Just a couple of last comments. On the fees issue, I'll just say again, I don't think a large impact fee is either going to be sustainable or I don't think it'll do what you originally intended. And personally, especially since properties tend to flip back and forth between short-term and long-term, I think a tax or a fee is actually a better way to realize some revenues for the city. And please do dedicate it into the city's housing trust fund. Thank you.
Thanks.
Andy, there is one more person who asked if you're willing to take any more speakers that just asked to be able to speak.
Is it a new speaker?
It's a new speaker.
Yeah, I would ask if they could just go briefly.
Okay.
It's getting.
Amanda?
Thank you so much for taking me. I'll try to be brief. Many of us have been attending these meetings for over a year. At the meeting on November 24th, Megan presented a very thoughtful and clear summary of the work of the committee has done. It was incredibly disheartening to feel like all of the valuable discussion that has informed this lengthy process might not have mattered. As Megan emphasized, the changes proposed at the last meeting were divergent from the work that this committee has done over the course of many, many meetings and months. The suggestions were significant change. I want to be very clear that this decision that you make will have a significant impact on the lives of small local families trying to creatively build lives in Vermont, including my own. We are not massive landlords. We own one property in Burlington. My husband and I bought our house for $315,000 in 2010. We are both Vermonters. We have invested personally and deeply in this property. After 10 years of living in one of those units as owner occupants, we recently moved to Jericho. Despite this move, we are still deeply invested in our Burlington community. We value our tenants, have had long-term tenants who have stayed for many years and are still friends with several of them. We bake them cookies. We are good landlords. We are the type of landlords you want in Burlington. We know our neighbors on St. Paul and Catherine Street and love them. We've never had a complaint about our STR from our neighbors. When we bought the house, it had 3 units. Currently, the exact same 3 units are still being rented as long-term rentals. We built an additional bedroom that is attached to one of those units, the one that we lived in for many years. It is this room that we hope to continue using as an STR. We have taken nothing out of long-term rentals in Burlington. We agree that more data would be helpful. We agree that a registration process working with Airbnb and other platforms would give this committee the information it needs to make better informed decisions. We think a cap on STRs could meet the concerns of the committee in a similar way to what has been done in other progressive cities. Thank you very much for your time and consideration and recognition of the fact that this is super complicated, and just appreciate the people who've heard us over many, 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 many meetings and many months. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are we all set, Megan, with the speakers who haven't spoken?
That's everyone who hasn't spoken already.
I know there may be one or two that want to speak again, but I'd ask for you to hold off on that. I really do want to bring it back to the commission and council ordinance committee. Also, just thanks to everybody who spoke. We heard a wide range of comments, and it's really helpful to hear from people from all different perspectives on this one. So, you know, I note that we're getting close to 8:30. I don't know if folks want to continue working tonight. If there are any comments, questions that people have, or if it's people want to just at our next meeting start in and really, you know, focus in on committee work for our next meeting and allow us to really do our work and dedicate a full, you know, a large part of the meeting for doing that. If we do that, what I would do at our next meeting is, you know, the committee would have our discussion. What I'd like to do is we have the proposed ordinance, and to really help bring focus to our discussion is for folks, when you have the comments or questions, to really focus in on what our ordinance is and if the draft that we have, and to propose specific changes to that. I think that can really help give focus to it, unless there's a, you know, global change where you want something dramatically different from what's in there. But the more we could focus on that, I think the better our discussion could go. Then after we have our discussion at the next meeting, that we could go back and have, you know, hear from public again, whether it's at the close of our next meeting or the beginning of the meeting that follows, depending on how long our discussion takes. But I want to make sure that we have, you know, on the committee a full, you know, full ability to have our discussion, comments, and, you know, for us to move in the direction that we want to do collectively. What are folks thinking?
Yeah, Andy.
Yes, Harris.
I just wanted to say a couple of things. I agree. I don't want to get into too much substantive things right now, considering the hour. But I do just want to say a couple of things. That it's you know, I really appreciate all the comments that have been coming in. The people have been showing up for a couple of years now. It's often not the case with our meetings. We don't get a whole lot of public input. So I appreciate it, even though it does slow things down. I definitely appreciate it. And I do read it and I do listen to it. So I'm a little taken aback at the people who think that it's all for waste and no one's listening and no one's reading it. That's certainly not the case with myself, and I don't think it's the case with others. I also just want to say that I hope there isn't a tone here that isn't accepting the new members of our committee. These are duly elected city councilors, and the other city councilors that were on this committee before were duly unelected, and they were great, but you know, that's just the way it is. Elections matter, and you know, I look forward to working with these city councilors and moving this forward. And I think that's the last thing I'll say is that I really do think we should move this forward, and we really need a path to either finish this up or just raise our hands and say, no, this isn't going to happen. It's too many conflicting things, and you know, people will just be non-compliant and maybe register as bed and breakfast. I don't know, but we kind of did that with historic materials. We tried and we just couldn't get it done. And I don't think that's the case with this. This really isn't as complicated and as you know, there aren't as many conflicting things going on here that I think we can do this. But I really want to, you know, see a way forward to get this done.
Great, thanks, Harris. I just want to, Harris, you reminded me of something that I wanted to speak to briefly as well, and it's an issue that came up a little bit during the public forum and in some communications that we've received. And that's the concept that I think some people may believe that we've made a whole bunch of decisions already. The work that we do on the commission is an iterative process as we, you know, work our way through proposals through drafts. And as of yet, I don't think that we've taken any specific votes on anything. And yes, we've been moving in a direction, and I don't know how this, honestly, I don't know how this will all end up, but we've been moving in a direction, and directions aren't, for the way we do our work, aren't always in a straight line. Sometimes they turn out to be squiggly lines a little bit, but we do keep moving. And sometimes things get revisited because people have different ideas, people have different thoughts. As you mentioned, Harris, sometimes we have different people who join us. But it is a continuing process. It's an iterative process. And until we get towards the end of something like this, we really don't do the votes. And so, there may be people who have having different ideas and different thoughts of what they want to do, but we're still continuing to move forward on this. And that's the way this has always worked on our planning commission, on anything of any level of complexity. So I know for people who are watching us, who've been participating for the better part of a year or more, it could get confusing and, complicated and sometimes be upsetting when it seems like we're repeating ourselves. But I would just say this has always been the way the process has been ever since I've seen Planning Commission working, well before I was even on it. But we do end up getting somewhere towards the end, and we're still in the process. We're not at the end of the process. So just ask people to have patience, and we do appreciate the comments that everybody gives us. So, anyone else? All right, so it looks like people are pretty much at least okay with what I laid out just before, that we will wind this down for tonight. We'll pick up at our next meeting, focused on committee discussion. I think we've gotten a lot of good background. We've put out some different ideas over the last couple meetings, and we've gotten a lot of information on that. Again, at our next meeting, I'd like to focus in on the language of the draft ordinance that's been given to us by staff. And so we could start working on that and start, focus on that and honing in on that. And if there are changes that we want to make to that, focus on those changes. And with that, thanks to everybody who spoke to us tonight, and thanks for everybody on the commission and council committee who are here.
Could I just add one request from a staff perspective for the committee members in preparation? I think, from a staff level, we have followed up on a lot of questions and requests for information that the committee has shared with us. And I think from our perspective at this point, what would be really helpful, as Andy suggested, changes that you would make to the ordinance, if you would like to make them, that are kind of within those 4 policy questions that we outlined for the discussion at the last meeting. I think that would be some of the most helpful feedback for us in terms of how we help you move this forward. I think the other question that we would really be interested in the committee's perspective on is the kind of 2 options for how you could move forward that we outlined at the beginning of the meeting, either with a clear outline of a zoning amendment that you want to advance to the council, or a more time limited option that could allow you to be more flexible. So those would be 2 things that for us to be able to continue helping this committee move this along would be really helpful.
Thanks. Chip?
Just Megan, to that, are those slides available on board docs, or are they being circulated?
We'll make sure to send them to you,
Thank you.
And post them online. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. And then with that, thank you, Megan. With that, we will close out item 4, move on to item 5, which are commissioner items. Do we have another meeting this month, or is this it?
This is the only meeting you have scheduled this month. I think the next meeting is January 12th. Did I put it in the agenda? Sorry.
Yes, it says January 12th and 26th. Okay. Any other commissioner items? Okay, then seeing none, we'll move on to minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept communications?
Could I make one note? Sorry, Andy.
Yes.
The way that the communications are listed in your agenda, it says those that are included in the packet, but we did send you a few additional communications that are also posted online right before the meeting.
Okay, so we do want to accept those as well. Is there a motion along those lines? Motion by Jennifer, thank you, and a second by Bruce. You blinked. I think you were seconding it. And a second by Bruce. Any further discussion? All those in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we have that. And next item is adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by Jennifer.
I'll
yay.
do it.
And a second by Emily. You moved this time. Second by Emily. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you. And since this is our last meeting of the year, happy holidays to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
y'all next year.